we are going to wrap up evolution. Nah, we're just gonna wrap up the theoretical stuff about evolution before in the next class applying the specifics of what we've learned to human evolution. What you've all been waiting for. How did humans come around? How did human beings get into the picture? So we, in the last class, went through Darwin and got up to Darwin and Mendel, and then briefly talked about the combination of Darwin and Mendel, which is called the modern evolutionary synthesis. We'll talk more about that in today's class, and that's basically where Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp take us to at the end of their text, is basically the modern evolutionary synthesis. They say in that text on page 75 that there's the modern evolutionary synthesis, or also called the extended evolutionary synthesis, but that's not entirely correct. The extended evolutionary synthesis is extended and it's slightly different, or it extends upon, adds on some stuff to the modern evolutionary synthesis, which is what we read in Augustine Fuentes, the first 5 pages of Human Niche, Human Behavior, Human Nature, which was really hard to read and difficult to understand, in part because, well, there's a couple reasons. One is that Fuentes is agreeing with the modern evolutionary synthesis, but he's trying to point out some flaws or problems or kind of put on some extra things, which we'll talk about what he's trying to do there. I will also say straight up front that this is kind of out there in terms of where the biologists are. Mostly in our biology classes, we learn through the modern evolutionary synthesis. So some people have this stuff is in some ways up for debate still. Our eventual goal was to do a rethinking of some of these old ideas that we may not have even known were with us. Some of them we did know are with us, because every time I said evolution, several of you said, aha, survival of the fittest. And I've been trying to convince you that that's not actually the best way to think about evolution. The other thing that is with us, although we may not know it, is this idea of the great chain of being, and as evolution being an ascendancy or an ever-ascending ladder of progress into the world. And so we may not be entirely able to say goodbye to those ideas because they're so entrenched, but at least we can know what they are and know the influence that they have had on us, so they don't creep up on us unnecessarily. I thought I want to finish this class on a rather more optimistic note, not just saying goodbye to things. Why does this matter? What do we want to say hello to then? And I'm going to try and tell you that if we can kind of adjust our thinking about evolution, then what we're going to say hello to is the possibilities and complexities of life and the continuation of life on this planet, which is what we would like to have happen. We don't want to say goodbye to life. We want to keep it going. The purpose of life is to keep on living. So that's what we're going to believe is our final goal here, but we've got to get there. So first, I want to go back into the genetics, the then and now of genetics. We talked about the natural selection then and now, and how different traits, the idea of survival of the fittest, different traits can be adaptive in certain environments and maladaptive in others. And since the environment is always changing, we can't have an absolute measure of fitness. So in the last class, we talked about how Darwin's idea and the people around Darwin, they didn't really know the mechanisms of inheritance. They saw it as a kind of blending of traits, what is also called the pangenesis. So that was around Darwin's time. The genetics of Mendel disproves the blending. And that's where those Punnett squares come in and all those things, but not all the time do they tell you why we do the Punnett squares. We learned about recessive and dominant. Cass summed it up really wonderfully in the last class, that what this does is it preserves variation through generations, even though you may not see it, even though it may not be visible. It endures and then can be worked on later in evolution and expands the possibilities for evolutionary processes and selection. So that's what we learned from Mendel. As I mentioned in the last class, we now know that simple Mendelian genetics apply to some organisms. He was very fortunate to be able to work with those pea plants and get some pretty nice statistics from pea plants. But most of the time, in most organisms, it's a pretty complex kind of thing that goes on. And most human traits that we have, including ones that we used to think were Mendelian, like eye color, are actually due to polygenic inheritance. When I was growing up, they told me that brown eyes were dominant and blue eyes were recessive. But, you know, if that were true, then brown eyes would be completely dominated all over the world. So it's actually a cascading array of genes which give us this, which give us the characteristics that we have. Muckle and Gonzalez and Camp mention a couple complex processes that happen, which are gene flow and genetic drift. I'm not going to sort of dwell on those. They're complexities and speak to us as the kind of randomness of a lot of the evolution that happens when different populations flow into each other or drift away from each other. We once had this idea that species sort of came about pretty quickly, but we now know that that's a long and complicated process. We also know that genes are dynamic within the organism. They aren't simply there and then they give you this blueprint that you're going to follow for the rest of your life. They change over time, they develop, and we've also begun to appreciate recently the importance of what is called epigenetics, or the environmental switches that turn certain genes on and off. So you may have a very similar genetic code to someone that is in a different environment, but different genes will be expressed by that person based on the environment that they grow up in. So we know now that this is a much more complicated process than what Mendelian genetics gave us, although of course it is still important, those principles that we have from Mendel. So after Darwin and Mendel had passed away, again, like I said, they did not know of each other's work while they were writing it. They had each wrote in very separate worlds, and it was in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that people put this stuff together as what is called the modern evolutionary synthesis. This is also known as the neo-Darwinian paradigm. So neo meaning new, the advanced Darwinian paradigm, or it is known, Fuentes calls it as the standard evolutionary approach. And so again, this is what is taught, and it's a very powerful and important approach and idea. But in recent years, in the last 10 or 20 years, I would say, Fuentes and he's drawing on other biologists, began to make the argument that we needed to supplement or go beyond this approach, that it didn't entirely, that it was it's necessary and important to us, but it wasn't sufficient for all the things that we needed to describe. So what he's saying here, when he talks about the standard evolutionary approach or the modern evolutionary synthesis, he's going to sometimes be summarizing it in order to then tell us how we need to do other things or go on from there. So what does he want us, what does he want to add to the standard evolutionary approach? So what he wants to do is give us a little bit of what is called the extended evolutionary synthesis. On page 2, he says it's going to expand beyond the selection-focused standard approach. So what he means by the selection-focused standard approach is an approach that concentrates on the classic elements of natural selection: reproductive advantage, competition over resources, and being able to have a reproductive differential. And the selection-focused standard approach has told us a lot about evolution, but it really concentrates on reproductive events and genetic change to the exclusion of some other ideas or other things that people have argued, are starting to argue is important. So he wants to include the processes of niche construction, ecological inheritance, and multiple modes of inheritance in evolutionary inquiry. Now, I want to talk mostly in this class about the idea of niche construction, but we'll also be talking about multiple modes of inheritance, although that's a very big way of saying, I think we'll be talking mostly about the idea of culture and behavioral or idea transmission across generations. Now, again, I want to contrast that, or I want to say that sometimes Fuentes can be confusing because he is talking about the standard evolutionary approach and the focus on reproduction and genetic change. So one of you quoted something from page 4 that says, that talks about in a nutshell. This is on page 4. I'm going to get the nutshell part. Aha, there it is. So page 4, top right-hand corner. In a nutshell, standard evolutionary approaches see evolutionary pressures as potential impacts on reproductive output. And so what he's saying here is that the standard approach focuses on those things that matter for reproduction. But then at the very end of that, if you kind of keep reading, he says that it remains incomplete, especially when applied to the human niche. Now, the reason I'm sort of dwelling on this is because of the image or the book image that I chose for talking about this for our posts and our comments is a book by Joan Roughgarden called Evolution's Rainbow: Diversity, Gender, and Sexuality in Nature and People. And what's really super interesting about Roughgarden's work is how they sort of talk about the vast diversity of gender and sexuality that evolutionary biologists have often overlooked because they were only focused on the reproductive sex, the stuff that they said would make stuff for the next generation. What Roughgarden does is go through all of nature and says, there's a whole lot more stuff going on out there if you look beyond some of the standard approaches that are only looking for things that, things that create offspring, that all kinds of creatures are engaging in all kinds of activities, which we might consider sexual if we opened our eyes a little bit. So kind of like I think what Fuentes is saying here is that human beings and other creatures are doing a whole lot of things to shape their environment and engage in a whole lot of activities that can be important in the evolutionary process. Like I said, I want to focus here mostly for simplicity and for kind of what is important to anthropology on this idea of niche construction. Now, this can be a little bit confusing because sometimes when we hear the word niche, we mostly think about people who are trying to find their own niche in the world. But niche construction refers to how organisms are transforming their environments. So if we know that genetics are being dynamic in an environment, and we're again going beyond the sort of this one gene, one trait Mendelian genetics model, we also know that organisms are constantly in the process of their lives altering the environment or altering the conditions in which they live. And we can see that in various organisms. Probably one of the most obvious outside of humans are, beaver dams and the way that they transform and make things, rivers go in different directions and make lakes and stuff, all transforming things in ways which are complicated. Birds and their ways they make nests, rodents, things that make houses. Some of these are intentional in the sense that they're trying to do them. I'm not saying they're making choices about them, but there's a lot of also things that are simply done unintentionally. In fact, we are all altering our environment every time we breathe in oxygen and breathe out and other stuff into the world. So there's all kinds of organisms that are altering their conditions. They're altering their environment. The idea of niche construction is that as organisms are altering their environment, those alterations can change the conditions of selection for the next generation. So that means that evolution is potentially more than simply what happens during genetic change and reproductive change. It happens because of what organisms do during the course of their lives, because they're then altering the environment and changing the conditions of selection. So what this means is that creatures are actively involved in their own evolution. It doesn't always mean we get the kind of things that we want, and there's a lot of unintended consequences. But when creatures do things like migrate, go to a different place, raft, we saw those rafting monkeys, when creatures alter the environment, or even when we and other creatures are practicing something called sexual selection, selecting mates who we're going to mate with, it can reshape the evolutionary process. And so, let's bring in a couple of people here. Just welcome back. You talked about how many species have behaviors that are transmitted, right?
Yeah, it's that their behaviors can be social and others will help you with culture, which I never really thought about like animals having culture before I read that part. And I just thought that it was kind of cool to like think about, because animals learn through each other and they learn like in a process of seeing and doing. And so realizing that this is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so in fact, not just the human animal, but non-human animals as well can learn from their parents. We saw some of that with the non-human primates and their use of tools and different kinds of behaviors in different environments. So many different species have transmitted behavior, but it's perhaps super pronounced when it comes to human culture. Right? Obviously that's developed among other creatures, but when it comes to human culture, the patterns become particularly complex, as Fuentes says. And humans transform their environment in ways that have feedback loops into our our biology and our developing genome. One very interesting example of this, to go back into Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp, is lactose tolerance. And this was at the beginning of chapter 3. There's this box on people developing lactose tolerance and how food matters, evolution in action. And in the United States, the United States didn't think much about lactose tolerance for a long time. We only had those drink milk commercials with the milk mustaches. You remember those? Maybe they're still around. And it was kind of assumed that everybody could do that. It's actually fairly unusual, or I would say the majority of human beings are not lactose tolerant in the world. In fact, only 1/3 of people are producing the lactase enzyme during adulthood. I mean, we all can do this as we're kids, which enables us to drink milk later on. So who has lactose tolerance? It's people who grew up, it turns out, or whose ancestors were very dependent on cattle and milk. And so this arose in several different areas, one of them being, of course, Northern Europe, but also in Western Africa, in Southeastern Africa, among animal herders there, in Saudi Arabia, and in parts of India, South Asia. And again, this is a percentage of the adult population. Even in those places where it's very prevalent, that doesn't mean you get to 100%, although some places get close, and some are, more like 50% or so. And so even some people in Southern Europe are not as a percentage-wise as lactose tolerant as those that were much more dependent on milks and cheeses up here. Where's my pointer? Not doing it right. Up here in the north. So I would first point out to you that lactose, will be talking about this when it comes to ideas about human race and human groupings, that lactose tolerance occurs among people of very light skin, very dark skin, and a lot of different skin tones in between that. So it's not something that is actually can correspond to our ideas about who lines up on the racial continuum. So we'll talk about this as something that is a biological variation that does not correspond, in fact, to our ideas about human race. But for now, what I want to talk about is the fact that this is an evolutionary change to the human organism that results in variability that has arisen because of human culture and human cultural transformation of the environment. Different people who domesticated cattle and were able to extract or rely upon the milk, cheese, and other products that they had. So this brings us again into ideas that have changed about evolution, which is the way in which the time scale of evolution occurs. So back in Darwin's time, everybody around Darwin thought about evolution as this very gradual process that happened over long periods of time in which traits were slowly accumulated. In the last 50 or 60 years, we've talked about other kinds of evolutionary processes. Well, Alex, what do we have in addition to gradualism now? Yeah, if it's not in front of you, it's hard to remember what it was. You're right. It's something that's not quite gradualism. It's called punctuated equilibrium, which is the idea that you have these long stretches of not much evolutionary change, and then you have what are called, sudden bursts of change, where a lot of stuff begins to change in evolution. Now, there's been some debate about, whether some people got very excited about punctuated equilibrium and said that was the way that evolution occurred, and other people are like, no, it's gradualism. I think that hopefully by now we have come to realize that both processes can be at work in evolution. And we should also realize that when the geologists and the biologists talk about punctuated equilibrium and bursts of change, they might be talking about 100,000 years or 20,000 years, which is, a very short period of time in evolutionary scale, but in terms of our lifetimes, what we think of as generations, is still a very long time. So we have realized that evolution can occur more quickly than we thought, and lactose tolerance is one of those examples of something that has happened relatively recently in human life. So this leads Fuentes and others to propose something that he calls the human niche, which is the title of this article. And the idea here is that humans are some of the best niche constructors around. In fact, if you look around right now, you'll realize that we've done some amazing niche construction here. Nothing we see, trying to think of anything that's natural around here that would have been around here 200 years ago. No, there's no nature here. We don't even have a window to look out on nature. We can't see it at all. Everything we see around us in this room has been constructed in order that we have a whole different environment. So what is the human niche? The increased use of extrasomatic materials. By extrasomatic, that just means outside of the human body. The things you're using, pens, clothes, shoes, desks, tools, and the dynamic feedback between action, perception, and neural structures. Whoa, that's what you're doing right now. You've been using these tools, you've been trained in a way, we're sitting at desks, and you're having a feedback, hopefully, a dynamic feedback between action, the things that you're doing, perception, and your neural structures, which then alter the potentials for information acquisition and problem solving. And now you're able to acquire information, solve problems, and pass that on to the next generation, which is going to change the conditions of selection in the next generation, the kinds of traits that we're hoping to promote, the kinds of activities that we're hoping to help people do. I guess I would say that probably not many of your parents encouraged you to be iron workers, develop your iron working skills. Probably should, but it's faded out as this kind of thing that we need to have as a trait. So hunting, probably weren't encouraged to do much persistence hunting of non-human animals. So our traits, our selection processes are changing. What Fuentes argues that this enables us to do is to rethink the idea that we have that human nature is one fixed thing that has been present with us for forever and is the same for all the members of our species. So instead, what he argues is that what this enables us to do is think about human nature as a suite of potentials. Suite. A big room full of different things that we can draw on, different potentials that we have, which we get from our evolutionary history, which has for a long time been flexible and diverse and vibrant, our present, and our flexible capacity to create and sustain human cultures and to be shaped by them. So again, think about lactose tolerance and growing up in a society in which cattle herding is important as opposed to a society in which planting things is important, or a society in which hunting and gathering are important. These are all different kinds of human cultural activities which then reshape our evolution. So describing and assessing the actions of evolutionary processes and patterns in the human niche, which again is to say that by participating actively in our environment, we then change our own conditions during evolution. Now, that brings us to what we wanted to say goodbye to, which is goodbye to these ideas of the great chain of being and survival of the fittest. So first of all, evolution doesn't result in some sort of automatic marching ahead to better and better and better. As we've seen, the environment is going to be always changing. We're in an interaction with other organisms which are themselves reshaping the environment. As we've seen, traits that are adaptive in one environment might become maladaptive or bad in other environments. So if you're a lactose tolerant individual who then goes into a whole different kind of a place, that might not be the best trait, or it might not work out so well for you. Or if you're a lactose intolerant individual who has been pushed milk and cheese all the time, it might not be the best thing to have. Fortunately, now we have those little pills and lactase things that you can buy, so you can be a milk drinker if you want to be. And so the idea that we had in the old days that humans were these sort of perfect creatures at the pinnacle of evolution with all the best traits, we have to realize that all of our traits involve trade-offs. So there's something that Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp told us at the beginning of the chapter on page 58. We are far from the perfect creation, biologically speaking. Humans are more like an accumulation of quick fixes that serve a purpose. The biology that enables people to walk upright, for example, works well for a long time, but not necessarily into middle or old age. Just ask an older person how their feet, knees, hips, and back are doing. Well, not as well as they used to be, I'll just tell you right now. They deteriorate over time. So these things, and well, what we'll be talking about in the next class is the emergence of bipedalism and walking, and people get all excited about that because it seems so cool, but you know, over time, maybe it hasn't been so cool. There's trade-offs and all these things. The other thing is that evolution doesn't always work. And I guess I put work in quotes because it works, but it works in ways that might not have, that we might not like so much. So, Ariana, what happens if the environment is changing and you're a species that is well adapted to that environment, but the environment is changing? What might happen to you? Yeah, a lot of times, most of the times, as the environment changes, you go extinct. In fact, it's estimated that in evolutionary terms, over 99% of the species that have ever lived are gone. They're not here anymore. In fact, as the environment changes, most of the time, it's not, the reason I say that evolution doesn't always work is, it's not that like there's going to be that adaptation present. You don't know that it's there. Sometimes it's there and you get lucky, you're able to adapt, but sometimes, most of the time it's not, and you just die. So then you're extinct. And by the way, this isn't right now, this is like over millions of years. I'll talk about the right now in a second. So, you know. And there's nothing inherent in the evolutionary mechanism, even of natural selection, which says that the next adaptation is going to be more complicated than the previous. So we see the emergence of more complex organisms over time, but that's not because of anything inbuilt into the evolutionary mechanism. That's simply because of chance. Sometimes being a simpler organism is going to make you more adaptable to changes over time. You're simpler, you're not complexly adapted to a changing environment. And so perhaps the most successful evolutionary organism, the most successful organism is the single-celled organism, the bacteria. They're the winners of the evolutionary scheme. In fact, they're the winners of us. I don't know if you know it, but we have more bacteria growing in, on, and around our bodies than we have actual human cells. We need them to digest things inside the bacteria, our gut bacteria. We need them to live. And our actual bodies have more bacteria than there are human cells. So they're the winners. They'll be here long after us. So we have to be careful about the idea that everything's getting more and more. I mean, everything automatically gets more complicated. That's a good idea. Some people like to look at this as less of an ascendancy model and more using the metaphor that in the nice little picture that shows up in Michael Gonzalez and Camp on page 74 as the braided stream model of human evolution. And the idea that there's one interconnected species at all times, but there's different things going on and they flow apart and then they flow together. And in this model, we have I think there's some feet somewhere, some bipedalism and some language and some hands. Oh, there's the feet. But, you know, it all flows together over time. So we'll be talking about some of the characteristics of human evolution in the next class. But this is, I think, is perhaps a better analogy if you want to think in naturalistic terms about the ways in which evolution occurs. Now, the question is, who cares? What difference does it make if you have good metaphors and ideas about evolution, or if you're all caught up in great chain of being and survival of the fittest ideas? I think that if we only have these, if our ideas of evolution is this sort of progressive ascendancy fantasy that everything's getting better and better, or the opposite, it's only fatalism, we're not going to see the complexities of life. We're going to reduce our appreciation for the whole of the human and the natural experience and how different organisms interact with each other and how we do a whole lot more than just reproduce and have genetic change. And we're going to miss out on being able to see different kinds of possibilities. And so I know I keep wondering if I'm making Delaney too sad, because what's happening, Delaney, these days that we're worried about? Everything else I know, but I guess in this chapter, yeah, climate and the possibility that those 99% of extinctions are going to be us and like everything else because of climate change and those kinds of things, which is a good thing. No, I mean, it's not a good thing. It's something that we should be concerned about. It's good for us to be concerned about. But we want to not despair. Despair is not what we want. We want to be able to see different kinds of possibilities. And in fact, Cass, you talked about something that was weird about things when the environment is changing and different species are being pushed together. What happens?
So I was wondering, even if we are completely destroying the natural environment, hybrids would possibly be able to adapt to that.
Hybrids, new creatures coming together and making new hybrid things. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing that's going on, that, you know, different creatures are coming together. And I mean, we've done this with tigers and lions and making ligers and stuff like that, but this also occurs in the natural world. And in fact, hybridization, as we'll see, is very important in human evolution as well, and different kinds of hybrids that occur along species lines which are not as well defined as we once thought. I put the title of this book up. Eben Kirksey is an anthropologist who gets discussed for a different book in Muckle Gonzalez and Camp. But in this book, and it was called Emergent Ecologies. As you can see from the picture, we have, you know, kind of I think that's probably an oil rig or something in the forest. And he's talking about here how, although there's a bunch of, you know, doomsday scenarios for environmental change, he's trying to, as he puts it, reject apocalyptic thinking and instead find possibilities in the symbiotic associations of plants, animals, and microbes that are flourishing in unexpected places. So things that are coming together and doing different things, and the human beings who are in fact helping some of these plants, animals, and things go along. So Kirksey is an anthropologist who's been involved in what is called multi-species ethnography or multi-species research, to kind of figure out how things work together and cooperate. So apparently in this book, he talks about frogs, fungal pathogens, ants, monkeys, people, and plants who are being kind of put into people who are caring for them and putting them in different environments. In fact, just today, my wife turned on NPR and they were talking about releasing sparrows, an endangered sparrow population in Florida. And all of a sudden it's gone from, they were down to 80 poor little sparrows, but now they're up to 120. So the sparrows are, at least these sparrows, are making a little bit of a comeback. So again, I think that if we have, I think that changing our ideas from the incorrect ideas about, it's just a survival of the fittest race, will hopefully open our minds to the possibilities out there that we might be able to do new and different things and avoid the end of everything that is still avoidable.